In March of 1979, a 2-hour television pilot opened in American cinemas. It grossed $21.6 million at the box office before a single episode aired on television. The weekly series that came out of it beat Doctor Who in the United Kingdom for 16 straight weeks. 18 months later, the show was dead. 11 episodes into a second season. No finale, no goodbye. An episode called The Dorian Secret aired on April 16th, 1981, and then nothing. I'm Bast with just iconic rewinds. And this is why Buck Rogers in the 25th century failed. In 1979, Universal Pictures and NBC were both trying to recover from the same disappointment. ABC had canceled Battlestar Galactica the previous April after one season, despite the show being a top 30 performer. Universal had built that series. They had also noticed something specific about it. The 2-hour Galactica pilot had been released theatrically in overseas markets and had made real money. It had played in cinemas in Canada, in Australia, in Western Europe, before it ever aired on American television. Universal decided to do the same thing again with Buck Rogers, but harder. The Buck Rogers pilot would be released theatrically first in the United States. 6 months before the series premiered on television, the pilot opened in American cinemas on March 30th, 1979. Production budget around $3.5 million. Domestic box office gross, $21.6 million. Adjusted for inflation, that is roughly $77 million in current money. For a film that most of the audience would later be able to watch for free on NBC in September. The man building the show was Glen Larson, whose Battlestar Galactica had just been canceled across town. Larson was direct about what he wanted Buck Rogers to be. He told Epic Illustrated magazine that the concept was, quote, Buck as Burt Reynolds in outer space, end quote. Not the brooding, militaristic Galactica, not Star Trek's philosophical optimism, a swaggering, slightly disreputable space cowboy. With dance scenes, with disco, with a robot sidekick who said bitty bitty bitty. Universal financed it. NBC, the weakest network in primetime under President Fred Silverman, bought it. The series premiered on September 20th, 1979. The man running the writer's room day to day was Bruce Lansbury. He had previously run Mission Impossible, Wonder Woman, and The Wild Wild West. His story editor for most of the first season was Alan Brennard, a young science fiction novelist who would later win the Nebula Award. The production was located on the Universal backlot in Los Angeles, with sets built around what the producers called the Inner City. The capital of the surviving Earth was called New Chicago. The military body that ran the planet's defenses was called the Defense Directorate. Gil Gerard played Buck. Erin Gray played Wilma Deering. Tim O'Connor played Dr. Hewer. Felix Silla wore the Twiki suit. Mel Blanc, the voice of Bugs Bunny and almost every Warner cartoon character anyone over 40 can name, voiced the robot. If you were a kid on a Thursday night in the fall of 1979, you remember the cold open. The disco-inflected synthesizer score was unmistakable. The white corridors of the Earth Defense Directorate always looked 1 degree too clean. Wilma stood on the bridge of her starfighter in spandex. The robot said, bitty bitty bitty. It was the future you had been promised in toy commercials, and NBC was airing it in the Family Hour every Thursday at 8. The costumes were by Jean-Pierre Dorliac, who received an Emmy nomination for the show. The spandex jumpsuits, the gold lame, the Ardala outfits that NBC's Standards and Practices division kept asking to be modified. Princess Ardala, played by Pamela Hensley, was the closest thing to a recurring antagonist. Her enforcer Kane was the closest thing to a serious threat. The show ran 24 episodes, including the 2-hour pilot. The Nielsen ratings finished outside the top 30 for the 1979 to 80 season, but that number requires context. NBC was a distant third-place network that year, and Buck Rogers was one of the few new properties NBC had that anybody outside the executive suite was paying attention to. Internationally, the show was something else entirely. On ITV in the United Kingdom, between August 30th and December 13th, 1980, Buck Rogers beat Doctor Who in the head-to-head ratings for 16 consecutive weeks. The British numbers were not close. Buck Rogers was pulling between 12 and 13.5 million viewers a week. Doctor Who, in the same time slot, was pulling between 3.7 and 5 million. The BBC eventually rescheduled Doctor Who to escape the competition. A show that finished outside the American top 30 was Across the Atlantic, a national event. That is the show Universal and NBC had at the end of the first season. Solid domestic numbers, an international phenomenon, strong merchandising, a theatrical run still in profit, a creative team with Emmy-nominated work on screen. Then the Screen Actors Guild went on strike. Before we get to what happened during that strike, if you are enjoying this, like the video and subscribe. It helps the channel reach more people who remember what Thursday nights on NBC felt like before the gap. Thank you. Let's keep going. The 1980 actors' strike ran from late July through October of 1980. Production on every American television series halted. When the strike ended, Buck Rogers had been off the air for almost 6 months, and the second season had to be ready to launch as a mid-season entry in January of the next year. In that gap, almost every senior person who had built the show left. Glen Larson, who had been executive producer and name and architect in fact, was off the show entirely. Bruce Lansbury, the showrunner who had stabilized the first season, was gone. The producers, the story editors, the writer's room Lansbury had assembled, all of it was gone. The only senior production figure who carried into the second season was line producer David O'Connell, and he only stayed for the first 2 episodes. In their place, Universal brought in John Mantley. Mantley had spent the previous 20 years running Gunsmoke. He had also produced How the West Was Won and several other westerns. His science fiction credentials in 1980 were limited. His mandate, in his own words to Starlog magazine in October of that year, was to get the show, quote, back to basics, end quote. What followed in the next 4 months is the smoking gun. Before we get to what Mantley actually did, here is the version of the story that gets repeated. It goes like this. Gerard was a difficult star. He rewrote scripts on set. He fought with NBC. He pushed his weight around. So the second season was a punishment, or a course correction, or alternately, the audience had simply tired of science fiction after the post-Star Wars boom cooled. Or, in the most specific version that circulates online, Erin Gray's dialogue was systematically reassigned to a new character named Hawk, and Wilma was hollowed out to make room for him. Gerard addressed the Wilma claim directly in a 2005 interview. Quote, I can't recall seeing a script where Erin's lines were changed, so they were Hawk's lines, and I would remember that because I was very watchful of her character, end quote. Erin Gray in the same interview was more direct. Quote, it's just a bad rumor, end quote. Gerard was a difficult star. That part is true. He had legal threats from NBC during the first season, he rewrote dialogue on set, and his writer's room fought him on it. But he had also, just before the second season started, told the producers that he would not continue as Buck unless Erin Gray's contract was renewed. The producers had been considering not bringing her back. Wilma stayed because Buck refused to come back without her. That is not the behavior of a star sabotaging his own show. And the science fiction fatigue theory does not survive contact with the international numbers. A show pulling 13 million British viewers a week was not a property whose audience had walked away. The thing that killed Buck Rogers was not Gerard's behavior. It was not the post-Star Wars market. It was a series of specific production decisions made by John Mantley between July of 1980 and January of 1981. The first of those decisions cut the budget in half. The last of them was the only choice he ever made that his cast forgave him for. The per-episode budget went from somewhere between $800,000 and $1 million in the first season to approximately $500,000 in the second, about half. The shooting schedule was cut by a full day per episode. Earth was abandoned. New Chicago was abandoned. The Defense Directorate was abandoned. The entire premise of the show, which had been a former 20th century pilot adjusting to life in a rebuilt 25th century civilization, was discarded. In its place, Buck and Wilma were assigned to a starship called the Searcher, whose mission was to find the lost tribes of humanity scattered across the galaxy after a nuclear war. That is, almost word for word, the premise of Battlestar Galactica, the same show Universal had just lost a year earlier. The canceled series Universal had on the back lot, the one whose ghost ended up inside Buck Rogers' second season. The Searcher itself was not a new build. It was a redress of the cruise liner set from a first-season Buck Rogers episode called Cruise Ship to the Stars. Buck's personal shuttle, in several second-season episodes, was a redressed Colonial shuttle from Battlestar Galactica, still on the Universal lot from the canceled show. Dr. Hewer was written out. Tim O'Connor, who had played the role for an entire season, was simply gone. Dr. Theopolis was gone. Princess Ardala was gone. Kane was gone. The villains who had given the first season a sense of consequence were retired without explanation. In their place came Admiral Asimov, played by Jay Garner, and Dr. Addis Goodfellow, played by Wilfred Hyde-White, and a stuffy British robot named Crichton. Mel Blanc was ill for the beginning of the second season, and Twiki was revoiced by an actor named Bob Elia for the first several episodes. The narrator changed from William Conrad to Hank Sims. Wilma Deering, the most popular original character on the show, was rewritten into what Mantley described to Erin Gray as a more conventional supporting role, because the first season version had been, in his words, overbearing. That is not a creative reboot. That is a different show wearing the old show's name. Gerard, in the same 2005 interview where he defended Erin Gray's dialogue, was unambiguous. Quote, "I hated that season. It was such a ripoff of Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica. I was thinking, why are we doing this? I always wanted Buck to stay on Earth, but we got a new executive producer who had no respect for the audience and the show." End quote. Gray was equally direct about Mantley. Quote, "He had a big ego, and he wanted to create something with his own look. So he could say, I created this." End quote. Mantley brought his own writers from Gunsmoke. According to Gerard, at least one second season script was a Gunsmoke teleplay that Mantley had personally written years earlier, with the same dialogue, the same dramatic beats, and even the same guest actress, Barbara Luna, cast in the equivalent role. A Western produced for a sci-fi audience. The audience noticed. The ratings dropped. The second season ran only 11 episodes. There was no finale. The episode that closed the run, The Dorian Secret, was a standalone bottle episode. NBC canceled the show in the spring of 1981. And here is where the story gets stranger. The two-part premiere of the second season, the very episode that introduces the Searcher and everything wrong with it, also produced what most people who have watched the entire series consider its single best installment. This is the choice Gerard and Gray forgave Mantley for, even when they could not forgive him for anything else. The episode was called Time of the Hawk. It was the introduction of a new character named Hawk, a birdman whose entire species had been hunted to near extinction by humans. The role went to a stage actor named Thom. Christopher's audition is part of the show's lore. The audition scene was a quiet monologue in which Hawk holds his dying wife, Corey. According to Christopher's own account in a 2011 interview, Mantley wept reading the scene with him in the audition room. Christopher got the part on the spot. Critics who have written about Buck Rogers in retrospect, including the novelist Christopher Bennett and the cult television historian John Kenneth Muir, consider Time of the Hawk to be a quantum leap above anything the first season ever achieved. The same season that gutted the show also produced its high watermark. Mantley and his producing partner John Stevens approached Christopher during production. According to Christopher's account, Mantley said, quote, "Thom, if we get another season pickup on the show, the studio and we feel we'd like to do a spin-off series of The Hawk. The audience response has been so positive." End quote. That spin-off never happened. The cancellation came before the discussion could become a development deal. The producer who had destroyed the show as it was had simultaneously, accidentally, created the one element of it good enough to deserve its own series. He never got to make either one. 24 episodes of the show that worked, 11 episodes of the show that did not, a theatrical pilot that outgrossed most science fiction films of the era, an international run that humiliated the BBC, all of it gone, because a producer who had never made a science fiction show in his life decided he could make one in 4 months. That is what killed Buck Rogers in the 25th century. Not the audience, not the ratings, not the star. A strike opened a door. A producer walked through it, halved the budget, threw out the world the show was set in, replaced the cast, sidelined the female lead, revoiced the robot, and called it a second season. The audience left because they were not watching the same show. The legacy is strange and quiet. The complete series came to DVD in 2004. In 2020, Kino Lorber released a 9-disc Blu-ray with new interviews from Erin Gray and Thom. Gerard was approached for the project. He declined to participate. The show has been in continuous reboot development since the mid-2000s. Frank Miller was attached at one point, Don Murphy was attached at another. Since 2020, Legendary Entertainment has held the rights, with George Clooney attached as a producer and Brian Vaughn briefly attached as a writer. None of the reboot attempts have entered production. A competing claim from the Nowlin Family Trust has tied the property up in litigation. As of October of 2025, Legendary attached the writer Zeb Wells to a new feature draft. There is still no director and no cast. 45 years of attempts to bring Buck Rogers back, and the property has not aired a new episode since The Dorian Secret in April of 1981. On December 16, 2025, Gil Gerard died at the age of 82 of cancer. His final public message, prepared in advance for release after his death, read, quote, "Don't waste your time on anything that doesn't thrill you or bring you love. See you out somewhere in the cosmos." End quote. He spent his last 45 years giving interviews about the season he hated and the show he never got to bring home. If you have a memory of Buck Rogers from Thursday nights in 1979, before the gap, tell me where you watched it in the comments. If you like the stories of shows killed by their own producers, subscribe. I'm Bast with Just Iconic Rewinds. Thank you for watching. See you tomorrow.